My name is Daryl George Wilson. I was born in Angola, Indiana on a farm and raised on a farm till I was about, probably almost 7 years old. Then moved to a small town called Angola, Indiana. So basically I'm a farm boy. I've always been associated with farm. And after I got out of the Navy, I went back and made my living dealing with farmers. I graduated from high school in '42 and enrolled in Illinois Wesleyan University in the freshman class. And I think it was in February, 20-some of us out of the fraternity decided we'd go and join the Navy Air Corps. So we all went down and joined the Navy Air Corps. And they didn't call us then until after the first semester, or first year in college was over with. And then I went in June. Only 2 of us got our wings out of those 20. 3 or 4 of them, I couldn't pass the swimming test. Seems impossible, but they just couldn't pass it. And the rest of them, I really don't know what happened. They just didn't, we went different directions, different bases, and I didn't run into any of them again. I feel a little self-conscious about this because I never was in combat. I've had an awful lot of experiences, but they were all in training. We went to pre-flight and then into primary, which is using where we get the first aerobatic training and the first formation flying. We started out in Stearman's, and they had spoilers on the front of the wing, so they landed hotter than a normal Stearman. So we had to learn to fly with, hotter plane landing. But that's a terrific airplane. It's almost impossible to tear it up. It can do anything aerobatically. Didn't cruise, I think cruised about 65 miles an hour. It wasn't very fast. But for training, it was great. Well, initially you do all kinds of aerobatics, so you know how to handle the plane in all those situations. And then you learn individual combats where it's just 2 planes. And then you learn combat with 2 planes and twisting and diving and split S's and everything to get out of the way or to get the jump on somebody. Navy training was terrific, I think, very thorough. We got so tired of hearing certain things over and over again, but in the long run, they proved that it was smart. Like our close formation, the Navy flies them so close, but you learn to operate your navigation board and your trim tabs and everything and fly real close formations. We could move up a little bit and touch the wings without much trouble. Flew a wing on a guy once and he was kind of going to sleep, so you just move underneath his wing and just bounce him a little bit with your wing and he wakes up. But Navy didn't know anything about that. And then we went to final training in Pensacola, and then the rest of the training was in Vultee vibrators or SNJs, which I think is one of the best planes. Had a 600 horsepower engine. It could do anything that a fighter plane could do, not quite as fast. Had a machine gun that fired through the propeller, which left holes in the propeller once in a while. But the bullet goes through the hole, you can fire it again, it'll go through the same hole. Amazing. And they didn't take those propellers off, they just left them on there. And there we got into the gunnery and bombing and instrument flying and all the basics that we needed. It was Saltley Field in Pensacola that had a runway. The rest of them were all mats. Well, the mats were just great big round blacktop, really. And the reason they had them that way is you could land in any direction. You didn't have to stick to and so you could land into the wind and it's a lot safer to land in formation or take off in formation. So it was, and a cheaper way of building them, I think. We just cleared off the level of the land a little bit and put some blacktop down, and down you came. When they had a hurricane warning in South Florida, why they'd bring up planes from Miami and that area and land, and the Army would land at the base. Well, they were used to land on runways. Army approach and land is entirely different than Navy. Navy, just your land spot here, you're cut off and you just swing around and land just like you would on a carrier. Where the Army goes out and out, and then it makes a square pattern, comes in long ways like this. They used a lot more gas than we did, which might have been safer, but I don't think it was, because we kept the spot we were going to land at in sight the whole time. Man, we could go downwind on our downwind leg, see the spot we were going to land, and cut the throttle and come on in. Didn't take long. And they had no idea how to land on a mat. And they'd go off the end. We'd have to go pick them out of the sand. And so, of course, we got a big kick out of that. We used to kid and pick fights with Army pilots out of MacDill that were home on R&R. The way they trained us, that when we pulled the trigger to shoot the gun, you had a wing camera that took the pictures instead of the guns, you know. So they could grade us pretty darn good. And when we beat one of the guys from MacDill, we used to send the film over to him, which made lots of points, I imagine. P-51s mostly, which was probably a better dogfighter than the F-6F, but we could dive faster than they could. Went over to Melbourne, Florida, and got into F-6Fs there. That was quite a change. And you go from a 600 horsepower engine to a 2,000 horsepower engine, and that's quite a jump. The F-6F is just a grown-up brother, F-4F. They're so similar, built so much the same, except the F-4F had little wheels that you had to crank down by hand, came out of the fuselage like this, so it was a ground loop, and really had to be on the stick when you're landing because the ground loop's so easy. The wheels were so narrow. And but to fly it was, the only big problem was pulling the wheels up and down. You take off and right away you're flying with your left hand and cranking the wheels up. The F-4F just has, that the fighters had at the beginning were just no comparison to the Zero. So they had to devise ways to take what little advantage the F-4F have and use it. And so they shot down a lot of Zeros without being shot down themselves. First time I joined up in an F-6F, you got your instructor out here in a slow circle, put him this way, and then you have to come up and slide in here, join on him, and then switch across, and then the next plane comes up and does the same thing. Well, I was the leader, and I come up there flying a 2,000 horsepower engine, and I've been used to 600, and I had no idea I was coming in there that fast. So I come up and boy, I put the wheels down, I put the flaps down, everything to slow up, and I just kept right on going. And the instructor said, "Hey Willie, where are you going?" And of course I got kidded about that. And the rest of them saw what happened, so they come in a little carefuler. You have no idea what the difference in power is between these two. When you go like this guy's putting all the power on it he's got to stay there. When you go like this, you're cutting it all off. And you don't have any brakes. You got to anticipate fast. I can remember sitting out in the cockpit hours on end because we had to memorize every switch and everything, and blindfolded. The instructor would get on the wing and call out this switch, that switch, and we had to reach for it blindfolded. And I spent hours doing that. And it paid too. It was, one time I came in on carrier landing and the tail hook caught in the aft elevator steel. It was about as thick as this table. And the tail hook snapped, and I went into the first barrier and tipped upside down. And we're taught constantly preaching, and I got so tired of hearing it that if you're going to crash, cut off all the switches. And I think there was 32 switches in that thing. And I tipped upside down, the gasoline was starting to flow, and I thought, oh my God, where's the switches? And I had turned them all off going down the deck. I don't remember doing it at all. So that's training. I was upside down there and checking those switches, and the LSO said, is the pilot all right? And I nodded my head, and the guy in the asbestos suit nodded his head, and he said, get him the hell out of there. We got other planes to land. And it was quite an experience. That happened right after one of my wingmen, don't know what happened, but on the downwind leg, he spun into the ocean and was gone. And I was the one right behind him because I'd had a wave off. And we circled around him, destroyer come up, never could find anything but a little dye marker. He was a Greek, and his parents were from Greece, and they had what do they call it, candies, toffee candies that they make. And what do they call those? Can't remember now. Anyway, they had a little candy factory in New Jersey. Well, they didn't want him to go to war, and he was in a fraternity. And so he enlisted in the Navy Air Corps, but he sent all these letters to his parents, to the fraternity, and then they forwarded them to his parents, and they never knew that he was in service. And then he died, and we had to write the letter and send his stuff to his parents that they didn't even know. That should have been a whale of a shock. Then I was the first plane to land after that in operations, and I cracked up. I went down in the ready room and with the rest of my flight, and we were all crying and carrying on. And the loudspeakers come on and said, Wilson, your plane is ready. And I said, what in the world does that mean? And one of the other officers there said, well, you have to go up and make 5 landings because you cracked up. You have to right away, you have to right away, as soon as they clear the deck and they got the rest of the planes down, you have to go up and make 5 more landings. And I said, oh, baloney, they can take these wings. I took them off. And the rest of the guys said, oh, Willie, go ahead, you can do her. That was the hardest 5 landings I ever made. The whole ship's crew was watching me make 5 landings. And, but they found that if they didn't, the guy was never proficient after that. Even if you had a crack up on land, you had to do the same thing. You had to go out and land right away. Seemed to me like Pensacola, every time you turned around, somebody cashiered somehow or other. Mid-air collisions, and we got green pilots, and a lot of them, percentage-wise, we lost people in training more than they did in combat. So I lost 3 of them that were very close to me. Mid-air collisions, I came so close so many times that I came to believe that somebody was watching over me. And I started praying a little bit because I hadn't been. I came down once at Pensacola when you go out in gunnery, shooting on a sleeve, you go out in a triangle like this. And you got planes going out and shooting all the way. And we went out, and the wind shifted sometime or other, and we came back, and we got into the bunch going out here. And we were making vertical dives, high sides, and I dove, and you black out each time you come out. And I was just coming to, and I could hear in the earphones that, Willie, watch out, Willie, watch out. And I looked up, and here was an echelon of planes, and close formation, and I come like this, went right between them, never touched the stick or nothing. But there couldn't have been 6 feet on either plane for a head-on if you pulled out too fast at the end of a dive. When Wildcat, Hellcat, any of them, even the SNJ, you could black out. Well, it just depends on how many G's you pull. One guy can stand a lot more G's than the next guy. Some guys would black out for a long time, and other guys, I never blacked out for very long. It didn't take long for me to come back to, but every time a high dive, you come out, and the tow plane isn't far off the, you know, when you're making a high dive, and you're going right straight down, and you have to pull out, and you black out almost every time, but not for long. And you got your plane trimmed, it's flying itself for a second or two, and you come back to. Toward the end of our training, we got blackout suits, and it was hooked to a pressure pump, so it automatically inflated tubes in the pants so that you put a lot of pressure on your legs, and that'd keep the blood up in your head, and you could stand a lot more G's than you could without it, and they're still using that today. And that was a big improvement. Didn't black out near as long. I was making a high side rocketry run out in California, in the desert there, and I blacked out, and I come to, and I happened to look out at the wing, and there was a whole bunch of ripples in it like this, and I thought the wing was coming off. I thought sure as hell that wing was coming off. But as soon as we leveled out, those wrinkles left, and everything was fine. It was designed that way. There's so much give in the wing to come up during all that pressure. And we were at, Kevin and I, he took me to Washington, to the Smithsonian exhibit, and we happened to pass a F6F, and the guy taking him around said that was his favorite plane, the F6F, and gave us the history on that. And I happened to look at that wing, and it had been through so many dives that there were permanent wrinkle marks in the wing. And I pointed them out to Kevin. That's the first time I'd ever mentioned that to anybody. Made us carry this Bowie knife all the time, and we were in the United States. I didn't see any need for that. And one time I was flying, and we had a raft underneath the seat, and for some reason one of the cylinders blew, and that thing started bulging out and forcing the stick forward, so down. And then I remembered that knife, pulled it out and stabbed it, and the thing was fine. But I found out why the Navy does these things. Never hurt, never got a scratch. That Grumman cockpit, that's why it's called the Iron Works. Man, I saw a plane come in Melbourne, right, I followed him in. I knew it was a dead stick landing, and he didn't make it. And that plane went down just like a scythe, cutting down palm trees. And the motor went rolling one way, and pretty soon the wings came off, and then the tail section, and that cockpit just kept rolling, knocking down trees. Pilot get out with just a few scratches and bruises. Just fantastic. That's why all Navy pilots like Grumman. We were flying out to go out to the Atlantic, in the Atlantic for gunnery, and an oil line broke, and it went all over the windshield, and I couldn't see. So I, like a damn stoop, I put the goggles down, opened the window, and stuck my head out there and got the goggles full of oil too, hot. It cleaned it left a little film, but you could see all right. As long as the oil wasn't recoating it all the time. Nowadays if you fly upside down, they got another pump on the other side, but we had that pressure. 5 gallons is a lot of oil. Of course, that's a lot. 18 cylinders, about that big is a lot. I turned around, radioed in that I was coming back, and because we weren't far, and Melbourne, Matt was just off the beach, So the oil stopped coming, but the engine kept running, just kept running fine, and I was high enough. I knew if I could get to the beach that I could land. So I come in, and they told me I could see it, I could make it. And they radioed to me that to ditch it. Well, I wasn't about to ditch that thing. I thought they'd be grateful if I got it back down. Well, I was close to 8,000 feet, so I had over a mile if I could, and I had plenty of room. I had to slip it in, really. I come in high, and then I slipped it and landed. The engine quit just before I hit the beach. So I landed, no problem at all. And man, I got put on report and I had to go change spark plugs for a month, and kind of a bad thing on my record. Because they really frown on not obeying an order. When we were at Salford Field, they had a British unit there, and I think they were all from the gentry, you know. In England, they probably didn't drive a car. They had no mechanical skills whatsoever. And, you know, they'd never driven a tractor or a car or a truck. And they come over there and they get a mechanical thing, and that, you know, they just wouldn't listen to train well enough to do it. Arrogant, I suppose. They just wouldn't obey orders. And we were supposed to be training them. But they'd go up, no, just after they sold and start doing dog fights, and God, we were losing them right and left. And it didn't seem to bother me any. Scared everybody to death in formation, flying. And so we let them fly by themselves. And one night they had night flying, which means that they were advanced a little bit. But Salford Field had this runway going on, and they had all SNGs, Vultee vibrators over here, parked. And there was a little bit of crosswind from the left. And the first plane took off like that, went left, right into the creamed 5 planes and himself. So they got them all together and explained the situation, that you got to compensate for that. And the next guy took off, did the same damn thing. So they called it off. One time I got there, they trained by themselves. Well, first you have field carrier landings, and they're rough because you just go around and make landing after landing, and they've got marks on the runway simulating the wire. And you got an LSO, and you obey him all the way around. You're just looking at him. And he brings you in, and you land. And you get quite a few boys that tear them up coming in there. We had a big Swede. I don't know his name. He wasn't in my flight. But we'd been socked in out at Long Beach, Los Alamitos, for days, and we didn't land. So the guys were going in and imbibing a little because they didn't think we'd operate. And then all of a sudden it cleared, and we were called back. And of course, the guys that stayed on the base knew where they were. So, but he came back and nobody knew. He was drunk as the Lord. And he come around, wheels up. And they waved him off. Come around, wheels up. And they got on the radio, lower your wheels. And he come flying really pretty good. But finally they cut him, let him land. Boy, it's the prettiest sight you ever saw. Sparks, this was night field carrier landing. And the sparks were just beautiful, blue and white, just flying from underneath that plane. But he was cashiered out. But you see, your green pilots, not a lot of experience, new planes, powerful planes, and mechanics have a lot to do with it. The new planes don't come to the students. They're all really pretty well beat up by the time we get them. Carrier landings and takeoffs are entirely different. You sit there and you put the throttle clear forward, check everything out, nod your head and put your head back against the cushion. And I had it all going, everything going, and I wondered what the hell was wrong, so I went like that and he shot it. And man, it hit the back of my head. I could have killed the bugger. Never did find out who he was. We had to make 5 landings to qualify aboard a carrier, and that was our first real carrier landings, and there was a paddle boat that they converted. And it did look awful little down there. I remember I got into trouble there. All the other guys had qualified, and I kept getting a wave off because LSO was here and the landing spot was here, and you're supposed to come in, pick up the LSO and come right on in. Well, I wanted to see that spot I was going to land in, so I'd go sliding out here and then come in like this and land. I could have landed all right, it was all right, but it wasn't the way it was supposed to be. So finally he let me land once, and he come up to me, the LSO, and he said, He said, "You son of a bitch," he said, "you do what I tell you to. I'm ready to go home. I'm hungry." He just chewed me out. So I went up, and I was the last one, and nobody else, everybody else was watching me. It's tough, man. So I come in and made 5 almost perfect landings, I think, and we all got out of there. But boy, my flight razzed me about that, I'll tell you. Each LSO had to have flown and landed aboard a carrier in every plane that he brought in 100 times. In other words, his training was he had to go up and qualify and land F6F, F4F, or 4U, all of them, 100 times before he was allowed to bring that type of plane in. So he knew exactly what each plane characteristics was and how it should be coming in. You have to put your trust in somebody else besides yourself. You have to go through the mechanics of doing it right to start with, and you have to obey instantly the commands of the LSO. And so I don't know if that was part of it. I just have no idea, but certain ones were picked out for carrier duty. They stand out there on a little platform at the back of the, and then they've got a net below them. They jump in, if, you know, the plane's going to hit. You can't wave off. And once in a while you get a engine failure, you know. Well, anyway, he heard my tail hook catch and crack. Didn't know what happened, but he jumped into his net, and he told me later, he said that tail hook went sailing out to sea, right through where he would have been standing. You know, the hook is about as big as my hand and down below, and that's what catches the wire, but it's a big piece of metal. And it's got a little shock absorber there. It keeps it held down so it won't bounce up over the wire. And those wires are hooked to a hydraulic drum that plays out hydraulically. But you land from 90 to 100 knots, over 100 miles an hour usually, and you'll stop in the length from here to the wall. And you just surge against your soldier harness like that. It really isn't bad. It's a smooth stop. But you're stopping in an awful short distance. And then they back you up just a little bit, unhook it, and you go on across the barriers, and then they take them down the elevator just as fast as they can. But there's always planes up above. And if they give a wave off, for instance, and you can't quite make it, and you land above, cream up of a bunch of planes. They call it a controlled crash. And fighter planes are coming in a little bit hotter than the rest of them. I don't think I ever saw a TBM. They were so steady in the air that had troubles. But fighter planes seem to me like of course, I witnessed more fighter planes than anything else too, so I don't know. But you almost always had a hold while they cleared the deck of somebody that something went wrong. And hardly ever pilot error. The LSO doesn't let you land unless you're coming in right. You know, you get a wave off. So almost all the problems are mechanical. And they try their darndest to eliminate all those problems, and they do pretty well. But when you get that many people landing all the time, and they're in operation, they're training all the time. That's what you do when you're training in peacetime or wartime. You're out there making landings. Night carrier landing was, man, to this day, I don't think there's anyone that likes the night carrier landing. I've talked to many pilots about night carrier landings, and not one of them that their knee isn't shaking when they land. I know my knees were shaking so bad I could hardly push the rudder pedals. After I landed, I just heaved a big sigh of relief. We were among the first. They found out in the Marianas that they could land aboard carriers. So the word come back immediately that we all had to qualify. And so the only light we had to start with was the light on the landing signal officer. The deck we couldn't see at all. So you have to trust him. I had a hard time doing that sometimes, but we went out with a full complement of planes and come back with only 7 of them that were flyable, just from controlled crashes. I don't think we lost any pilots. Thank God I never had to make many of them. They just scare you to death. You just have no idea how black it is out there when all the lights are off and there's nothing but starlight out there, if that. At sea, if it's blacked out, why there's little microbes or something in the water that when it's disturbed, it shines and it creates a phosphorant glow quite a ways back at the carrier, especially when it's going fast enough to carry. See, we had to have at least 28 knots of wind across the deck. And those Jeep carriers we were flying, that's sometimes pretty rough to get. And you know, if they ever was dead still, we'd have an awful time landing. Now they've got lights that if you're in the path, you can see them. If you're not, you can't. But then we had light on the LSO, the only light we could see. Couldn't see the carrier at all coming in. But you have to make 5 landings to qualify. So you land, they unhook it, and you take off again and go around and do it 5 times. So I crashed 3 planes aboard carriers, no pilot error, all mechanical errors. There's so many times it just something happens, and you get out of it without anything. And it happened to me. One time the left oleo gave way, and I was hung by the tail hook over the edge of the carrier deck, and the waves were hitting the motor, and they got me out of there. And of course, the other planes in the air, they had to get them down, so they bring out a torch and cut the tail hook, and it's into the drink it goes. No, you can't save them. They don't. You got, you know, if you're landing in land, well, they just pull it off the side and you keep going, and then they save the plane. But none of the planes that I cracked up in are really all that bad, but they just had to clear the deck to get other planes down, so you just throw them overboard. And they pushed me up, and there was planes up in the air running out of gas. There's so many mechanical things that can go wrong. I only saw one wire break, and but you get a lot of, well, the other thing that we're taught is you've got to have the tail hook out and locked. You've got to verify that it's locked, because it isn't, it has about that much play in it, and that initiates a impact so great that it tears the back end, the tail right off the plane. So you see quite a bit of that. Almost all the movies you see a plane with the tail hook, the empennage just ripped apart. And that doesn't happen unless that tail hook isn't locked. So that pilot would be strictly lectured to. You didn't have it down and locked. So we were always careful about that. Of course, the LSO keeps you lined up and gives you the cut or the wave off. They had quite a few. I only saw one, but of guys that got too low and they didn't have enough power or the engine failed. They'd fly into the fantail, and that was almost always fatal. And they had gunners back there that got out of the way in a hurry. Carriers are big enough that they cut through the waves pretty well, and they're always going into the wind, so you don't get rocking motion. And we just didn't fly. I didn't ever fly in really bad weather. And the choppy seas, they always had waves, of course. The LSO is trained to cut you when you'll hit the deck on an upside, not going away from you, but coming up. That's why it looks so much harder than landing than it would otherwise. So you got the deck going up and down like this. He'll cut you so that you land on the upside. They were great guys. They kidded us when we did something wrong, call us stupid and everything else. Just kidding. Then we'd come back, well, you didn't give us the cut right. It's your fault. relieves the tension. Actual landing isn't as bad as it appears to a novice, but the things that happen after you land, God, it can be all kinds of things. Because usually you go in the ready room after a flight and everything's kind of tense. Guys are just starting to relax, you know, not saying much usually. And then they review what we did and how we did it in the ready room. And that was it for the day. I know it always scared me, but every time you land, your knees are shaking a little bit. I remember one time one of the officers told me that the admiral came out to visit and told the captain of the carrier that, he said, boy, those guys look awful young. And the guy said, well, if they weren't young, they wouldn't be doing this. It's an awful small target to hit after you've been landing in a big field. It looks awful little down there. Even though you're only, 500 feet high, it still looks little. Why nobody came up with that angled deck deal is beyond me, because we always had to land in a crosswind, because the burble from the island would come across the deck and like this, so you're always landing in a crosswind this way. The slanted deck would be, I think that would be fantastic. And they're so much bigger, they got so much room. And they've perfected the catapults. Our catapult on the Jeep carrier was fired with a 5-inch shell. Didn't have the bullet on it, but the force of the shell is what made so when they fired that thing, we jerked pretty hard. Whereas the steam ones, it's so much smoother. And I'm pretty sure it's not as hard on the planes as what the shell was. But I never knew one that didn't get us off. You get awful close to the water once in a while, but that was simply because the plane didn't have quite as much power as it should have had. And when you get down next to the water, you get a lift. It looks like the plane and the propeller's in the water, but actually you're getting a lift from the propeller wash hitting the water. It splashes up and helps you stay, and then you can gain your speed and get back up. Well, if that prop ever got in the water, it was done. It was just the speed off the tip of looked like it was in the water. I've seen that several times. If you run out of fuel and had a long way to go, you used to go down on the water so that you're just off the water and get that extra lift. So you didn't take as much gasoline to cover the same ground. I never had to do it, but I know of guys that did. When they first started the war, they needed pilots so bad they only had about 3 months training. So they had their training on the job. But they just kept getting more sophisticated and didn't need the pilots as bad, so they just kept adding things to the program. So my class, most of them graduated in 27 months. I graduated in 22 months simply because my name started with Wilson, W. Instead of being at the main field, I was in an outlying field, and where you get to know your instructors and everything, and they help you a little bit. Whereas in the main base, they knew that they trying to get rid of pilots, really, and very impersonal, whereas the outlying bases were really personal, where you got to know everybody. At the beginning, they lost so many pilots because we didn't know what we were doing, and that's why they increased, I think, the number of pilots that would be required. They were innovative. They're used to solving problems, and of course, they learned things that we needed to know in combat about the planes and about tactics and what we needed to know. So it was all good and would have been, I think, extremely valuable for the push on Japan. We didn't know much about supporting troops on land until they started on the islands, and then we learned a lot of stuff there. Most of it trying not to hit our own men, because you can't really tell down there. They devised new ways of the lines that we could recognize from the air, and they learned to put pilots down to direct. Man, there's just a lot of training. Experiences we had in training, had good reasoning behind them. I don't know how they picked the ones going into fighter planes. They must have had some criterion, but I don't know what it was. In my case, I was very fortunate. I think I know why I got fighter planes, because I could DR navigate, but the celestial navigation was beyond me. I came so close to washing out on celestial navigation tests, I couldn't tell one star from another up there. If I couldn't shoot the moon or the North Star, I was in bad trouble. You have to react to everything faster. And like a torpedo pilot is very little aerobatics or dogfights training, stuff like that. And dive bombers, that's different. We had to learn all of that. It was a lot of fun, but a lot of work. One of the biggest things was being scared you're going to wash out. It just, so many of them were being washed out that you have so many guys judging you and training you that I'm sure that some guys were washed out for that because we were aware of them, that they just weren't cutting it, you know. And that part of it, I think, happens pretty early. And some of the guys washed out for not obeying orders. The Navy was very thorough about seeing that there wasn't somebody slipped through that wasn't psychologically adaptable. And I think that washed out quite a few guys. I came in to Gross Seal for primary, and there's one busload that was coming in and 3 busloads going out to Great Lakes had been cashed out. So we were living in fear all the time that something was going to happen because they didn't need us. They didn't have the attrition that they thought they would have. And then they were just training us really for the push on Japan, I think, after that. Probably weren't too many Navy fighter pilots, especially carrier-based pilots, because there weren't that many carriers. And they kept lengthening out and adding new things to our training program because they didn't have the attrition in pilots that they expected. Our pilots, even though they had inferior planes to start with, managed to survive more than they anticipated. So actually they were saving us till they kept losing carriers so that the pilots had to go to a different carrier, but they didn't lose the pilots. So we were actually in surplus. There was some 80-some in my class, and I think only 7 of us got our wings. But a lot of those were probably better pilots than I am, but just happened to hit it wrong. We had 6 men in a flight, and we stayed together, so we'd learn each other's idiosyncrasies. I lost 2 pilots out of my group. I don't know how many other, you know, but it's a group of 6 each time. That's a big percentage. Problem was when you lost one of them, we had to get another one in, a stranger. He felt bad about it, and so did we. We had to wait to get our wings, and we'd done all the flying while they had some surplus SBD dive bombers, which have a dive brake with holes in it. I'm sure you've seen it come like this in the back of the wing. Well, all the guys flying them had to try that damn thing. So they wired them shut so that you couldn't do it. They just wanted us to go up, and they were more powerful planes than we were used to, so they just wanted us to go up and fly formation and get hours in and come back. Well, we were flying along, and somebody had thrown the lever so that the hydraulic power was on those things. And apparently the wire broke, but on one side they expanded, and I started flopping through the air every which way. And I didn't even know where that damn control was, and I found it and closed it again and came out of it. But boy, it was a little hairy for a while. And then later on, they opened it up a little bit more because they had a bunch of new carriers coming on, and we were supposed to be in on the invasion of Japan. So we had extensive training in rocketry so that we could come off the carriers and support the troops that were landing. It's amazing what a rocket can do. It's just floored me when I first started using the rockets. And I was a better shot with a rocket than I was with the machine guns. Then each plane had different colored paint on every sixth bullet, and you could tell who hit the sleeve and who didn't. And I wasn't the best one there. A couple of my guys got a lot more in there than I got. We used to have to go out over the Pacific to practice gunnery and stuff. And my wife would go out on the beach. So when we come in, we'd go along the beach and we'd wiggle our wings at them and then go up and land. So that meant she could come home. You'd fly a pattern around the convoy, and you had to navigate the whole thing. You know, everybody had a certain grid they had to cover, and then when we ran out of gas, we'd come back. But we'd just take a convoy from the United States and go out until they could meet us with planes, land planes, you know, and then we'd go back. On convoy, the carrier's staying pretty close, but when you're out just practicing at sea, why, the carrier's following a storm or something and staying, you never know exactly where it's going to be. So combat, the carriers were always trying to find the place to hide. And you never knew exactly where that was. We're telling us that if we get in that situation, why, we have to follow the TBMs because they've got radar. They can find it. Or we didn't. Well, that made the TBM boys mad because the fighter planes all landed first. We had less gas than the TBMs. You come back, you don't have much gas left. They have that figured out pretty close. In those days, there was no refueling in the air. We had no idea that you could do anything like that. So, but they didn't let us fly that long in training. It wasn't that essential. But in combat, that happened quite often. You'd be surprised how many planes are in the bottom of the Pacific. We always had a down plane, and I flew searches in the mountains several times. And once we took carrier north, and I think that was more training than anything else. We started out, and they said we were going to the Aleutians. That's a rumor. That the Japanese were supposed to be going to the Aleutians, and so we were headed up there, and then the Navy found out it wasn't true, so we were up north a little ways, and they had a down plane in the mountains, so we took off, and they had used fighter planes for searches because we could overpower downdrafts, so we could fly closer to the ground to look for than other planes. Because if you get a downdraft, we could overpower it. And so they used other planes, but they liked to have the fighter planes doing it. They had a destroyer back there, and those guys were trained. And every pilot they saved, we'd send over some ice cream. So they were very proficient. They didn't get all the ice cream they wanted like we did aboard carrier. We ate well aboard carrier. In fact, all through the Navy, we ate well. There just wasn't enough carriers for us. They kept building them, but they kept losing them, and then the pilots from the ones that were lost go to the new carriers, and instead of R&R, they keep the experienced ones out there, I guess. Standard carrier, they were a lot smaller than the Essex class. The Essex class was the last one. It was a biggie. Actually, most of them were, in the beginning anyway, were freighters. It's a Kaiser freighter, they put a deck on it, and that was it. We couldn't go any faster than a freighter could, so it was a very tiny deck. And when we went aboard the Essex class carrier that they had our gear aboard, we went aboard it for several days before we went back to San Diego. We were out in thermal California in the desert practicing rocketry training, and we were to fly back to San Diego and go aboard. But when we stepped aboard, my wingman was a guy named Al Miner, and he was a rebel, good pilot, but a rebel. And he looked at that, and he looked at me and he said, "Willie, we could land in formation on this thing." It had that much room. It was huge compared to what we were used to. I got a couple pictures of us laying around sunning on the deck, getting a suntan, and we were there for 3 or 4 days, and the war ended that night. The next morning we were going to go back to San Diego and get on a new carrier and start the training for the invasion of Japan. So Mr. Truman is a big hero as far as I'm concerned. We were all anticipating going overseas, and all of us intended to do that. If we hadn't, we wouldn't have trained that hard. The Navy put every plane that they could get in the air, and the F-6S were all gone to senior pilots, and that left our flight with F-4Fs to fly, and we were clear at the back, and they went up the coast and back down in formation. Well, you have just a little bit of wind change at the front. I mean, they're trying to fly just the same speed exactly, but and it slows them down just a little bit. By the time it gets back to the end, it's like cracking the whip. And man, we were flying with full throttle off and wheels down and cranking them down and cranking them back up, and then full throttle to catch up. It was hairy back there. Not dangerous, just hairy, trying to stay in formation and look good. But that long a flight, that's the first one we ever had like that, you know. And I'm pretty sure the lead planes weren't varying their, because it would have been worse. I think it's just change in wind direction that would change the speed of them compared to us clearing the back, because it was miles long. Busy time taking off and joining up with all those planes and finally get in position, and then we got in position over the land, then we come and start flying in to join on going up the coast. We had every plane from Los Alamitos, and San Diego had every plane they had. The carriers that were coming in put all their planes in it. It was a massive. TBMs were in it, everything. I don't know what it looked like from the ground, but I knew what it looked like from us. I could look as far as I could see with planes. Those that wanted to get out got out, and they kept wanting pilots to stay in ferry command to take the used planes. They had planes in the new planes coming all the time. Couldn't stop the flow, so we had to get rid of the older planes and bring the new planes aboard. And so that was extremely interesting. We flew every kind of plane there was. Some we'd never flown before. OS-2Us that used to direct the gunnery from battleships, you know. It was only designed just to fly in one spot, just fly in a circle, you know, and slow, underpowered. No pilot wanted to take them. They were just slow and no power, no nothing. And they had 3 of them that wanted to go back. They wanted to take to Oklahoma. So I said, "Oh, I'll go." And then 2 of the other guys said, well, they'd take it. Well, one of them got a sailor that wanted to go, and so he took him on. And you have to fly through a pass to get across, you know, from San Diego across. You go through the pass unless you've got you're on oxygen or something. But anyway, Al took this one. And we went on over the pass, and couldn't find him. We were waiting for him, circling on the other side of the pass. And finally, I got on the radio, and I said, "Al, where are you? We're waiting for you." He said, "Wait a minute, I'll be there just a minute." And I just happened to look down at the pass, and there's a road going over it. And here he was. He'd landed on that road, and he was taxiing over it, and he come down the other side and took off again. And there was no There was a bus coming, but it was clear down. That was about the only thing traveling yet was up there, but crazy. We flew a lot of planes that we were never really checked out in, but we had so much training that you soon adapted to any plane you got into. TBMs and dive bombers, they all had idiosyncrasies of some sort. And the other pilots would warn you about them, so you were kind of expecting it. The Curtiss dive bomber had electric prop on it, and it oversped a lot, which means it just started going as fast as it go with not biting the air. You weren't going anyplace. So you had to watch out for that, not put too much stress on it. I flew the F-8F, only nobody knows it. I flew, one of the F-8F pilots had to go take a F-8 plane up to the commander at Los Alamitos because he didn't want F-6 anymore, he wanted F-8F. So this guy was scheduled to take it up there, and he had a real hot date and didn't want to go. And he told me, he said, "You take it up there for me." I said, "Well, I can't do that. I've never flown the thing before." And he said, "Oh, Willie," he says, "it's just easy. It's the same as an F-6F. It's just a little hotter. Got to keep the nose up all the time." So he checked me out in the cockpit, and I signed his name and took it up there, flew an F-6F back in his name. Got by with that too. Again, it was after the war. It was a great plane, but I don't think it was any near as nice as it only had about 10, 12 miles per hour faster speed than the F-6F. And it had a idiosyncrasy to start with. It had a high-speed stall and a spin where, you're coming out and it'll go into a spin and you can't get it out of it. It's called a flat spin. And there's quite a few F-4Us down in the Everglades that went in. And usually you're low then, and it's hard to jump out of the darn things. So you always worry about that when you're flying. I only flew one once, and that was an accident too. It was a lot of work flying until after the war, and I entered the ferry command, and that was fun flying. The war was over, they didn't give a hoot about nothing, and we were taking planes off the carriers and going to Oklahoma City and junking them, bringing new planes back, and no markings on the plane. They couldn't trace them. We were above and below ground all the way. That was the greatest time I had flying. Most of the time up to that time was work, and after that it was fun. It isn't much fun just flying up in the air. It's dull, nothing to do. But when you're flying right on the ground, man, things are moving fast. It's fun. The cumulus clouds in the summertime they're fun. You have no idea how those big old clouds are moving around up there. And the last 20 minutes of the flight, we'd tail chase each other around those, and dive into the valley and climb up. Every once in a while, somebody didn't have as much power as the guy ahead of them, and he'd fall out and spin, go through, and you'd hear him say, "Watch out below, coming through," into the radio. Didn't want anybody down below when he came through. And we tried not to be down there. One of my crazy moments. We were coming back in up around San Francisco. No, Los Angeles. And here was this Navy blimp up there flying, and I thought, gee, that looks nice. So I went down, I did a loop around it. And I had no idea there was an admiral in there observing. And man, he got on that radio and he said, "Get the number of that plane." All up and down the coast, they were looking for me. And I think if anybody really wanted to, they'd have found me. But I went down on the ground right up next and got away from there and then joined up again, and nobody said a word. So I'm pretty sure that they deliberately didn't see me to report the number on that plane. So I got by It was after the war, and they couldn't get enough transportation to go home. So this sailor come up and he said, "Will you take me east as far as you're going?" And I said, "Well, fighter plane, no place for you." He said, "I'm a radio man. I worked on those." He said, "There's space for me back in the radio compartment." So I said, "Well, if you can get a parachute, why, it's all right with me, but I don't know you're there. But you got to have a parachute." So he got one, and he got in there. And the first stop we had was this Tucson B-29 base. So we pulled the same trick that we'd done before. We pulled out our tail hook, and we had one of the guys as a reserver, and we hit the sand at the end of the runway, and then we'd lift it up like this and fly down. Well, he had opened up the radio door that he got in with so he could see, so that meant his face was about that far from the runway. And I pulled up, and he struggled out of that thing, and he wouldn't go any farther. He was as white as that sheet of paper. Really scared him, and scared me too. There was a sailor up in San Francisco that needed a surgeon up there, and they wanted this guy from San Diego. So I agreed to take him up. It was a fancy top wing luxury plane inside to hold 5 people. The admirals had them flown around all over. So that was another thing. I wasn't familiar with the plane. And we got up there and it was socked in, closed. And I said, "Well, I got this doctor," and I had very little instrument training, really. I'd been trained, but very little. And finally the guy in the tower said, "Well, we've got you on the radar, and you're the only one in here. We'll talk you in. And you've got about 50 feet over the runway that's clear when you get down to 50 feet. So he talked me in, and I come around and actually Army approach and landing, came in, and I got down below, and he talked me just right. There was the runway ahead of me. I could see it. I landed, and man, I was shaking. I mean, sweat. I was wet. And the doctor got out, and he said, "Boy, it was a nice flight, son." He had no idea what we'd been going through. Going across the Badlands from Tucson to Texas, to Midland, there was nothing in that Badlands. And one time we must have gotten off course a little bit, but there was a little farmhouse out there, and it had trees. The only trees in the whole area were right here, and courtyard here. And so I decided I'd go over and check that out. And I went over, and here was a little boy and a little older girl just jumping up and down looking at us, you know. So I called over one of the guys. I said, "Let's go through that." So we went down. We dipped our wings between the trees, and the girl was screaming into the house, and the boy was just jumping up and down. Never got a report on it, though. Nobody ever turned us in. That ground just drops, and it makes a little valley. So we'd put one guy up to navigate for us, and the rest of us get down into those. And it was really interesting. You come up out of there to find your lead plane so you don't get lost, and pretty soon you see another plane dropping up out of the ground. It's the weirdest sight you ever saw in your life. We would go almost full throttle when we were ground hopping. So you had to have enough speed that if something went wrong, you could dead stick up high enough to jump out. So that's why we were going so fast. But man, you just a few feet off the ground, it's really moving. There was a hedge in front of me, and I was below the hedge. And so I hopped up over the hedge like this and come down on the other side, and here's a cotton field and all the guys picking cotton, you know. And they all dove into the ground, and I got out of the way. But crazy things you do as a young man. One time we knew we were over Midland, Texas, where President Bush is from. And it's just a little mat down there, and it was socked in. We couldn't find it. And So I decide, well, you circle up here and I'll go down and see what's down below us so we can know where we are. We'd been through there several times. And I come circling down through, trying to stay in the lighter clouds. And here was an oil derrick right here, just like that. So I went back up and I knew right where we were. So we all came in and landed. Nobody ever complained that I know of. You know, that if they did, the Navy ignored it. I have no idea. But we never, they knew, I'm sure they knew what we were doing, but they didn't say anything about it. And we weren't exposing anybody else, just ourselves, really. When we were in the Ferry Command after the war was over, we landed at Tucson, which was had a B-29 base there. Well, those runways are so long that if we landed at the end, it'd take forever. So we used to pull our tail hooks out, and the guy that didn't raise dust at the end of the runway with his tail hook had to buy the drinks. And then we'd just pick up and we'd fly to the end and then drop down at the last. At Tucson, it was the BOQ buildings were wood, you know. Navies, they were always cement. We had to stay overnight one time and we had to stay in that BOQ, and I went to bed that night and I turned my face to the wall and I looked and I could see through a crack in the where the wards were put together. And the next morning I got up and there's sand all over my bed from blowing sand through the cracks in the wall, and they're BOQ of all places. So I feel the Navy did well. And BOQs, there were black men in the kitchen, but the servers were all usually Filipinos. And they served us like kings, I'll tell you. By an act of Congress, I was an officer and a gentleman. And I appreciate that. It was a whale of a change, I'll tell you, from cadet to an officer, even if I was a lonely ensign. Well, I was officer of the day on weekend, Saturday, Friday and Saturday, because none of the senior officers wanted it. And the Navy at that time, no blacks could be in the regular Navy. They were always in the cook's department. And it seemed like the shore patrol, all the ones I knew, the little guys wanted to be in shore patrol. And this one time you go through the gate and on one side they're coming in, the other side they're going out, and I had the Jeep over here and they were lined up getting on buses here. And the big black boy with his sailor cap on was getting up ready to go on the bus, and the shore patrol guy went out and told him to get in the back of the line. And he didn't know I was over there. So he kept saying, "Get to the back of the line," and calling him names. And then he took out his stick and hit him in the head. And his hat went rolling off his head, and that big black boy just leaned over, picked it up and put it back on his head and stood there. You know, he wasn't gonna move. And I got there with my two shore patrol boys, and we put him in the brig. And he said, "You can't do that, I'm shore patrol." And I said, I think so. And it stood up. And after the war, United, they came down and wanted all Navy fighter pilots for the United Airlines, simply because we had every hour was no automatic pilot time, and we had every pilot was a navigator too, whereas the Army had separate navigators. They weren't. While we were in the Navy, we were talking about the flight staying together and organizing a field, and we thought, like everybody else, thought there's so damn many pilots, there'd be planes and fields put up all over the U.S., but never worked out. Too expensive. So we had a lot of pilots that never flew again. I'm one. I flew a couple times, and after flying a fighter plane and then getting in a regular plane, it was just nothing to it. I just never got a kick out of it after that. One of the guys that flew with me stayed in the Navy and he was flying jets. And he used to stop by our house every once in a while. And he told us that jets were a lot easier than reciprocal flying because there's no torque. Every time you change the throttle in a reciprocal engine, it increases the torque. So you got to adjust your trim tabs or compensate for it by moving your controls manually. And he said it was a lot easier. And then he went into Continental Airlines as a pilot. And he retired at 45 and owned a couple of farms up in northern Illinois and did a lot better than I did. I've always interested in planes. I tried to make it a practice to go up to Wisconsin to the biggest air show in the world every 3 years, and then my nephews got on to what I was doing, and they started taking me when I wasn't ready to go. I think they liked to go to me because I could explain what we were seeing maybe a little bit differently than what they could do by just seeing it. I'm proud that I did it and got through it, enjoyed it. And I think it did ruin me for civilian flying. It just seems dull. I could get into ultralights. That's what I would like to do that. They've gotten those things now so that they're just almost foolproof. And that's real flying. You're just 50 feet in the air, and even though you're going only 50, 60 miles an hour, it looks like you're really covering ground, you know. I've been up once in one, and it's so nice. It's so quiet, and the beauty around you, and you just hear a little wind noise, and that's all. You just soar around, and first thing you look for is the birds that are sailing around you. They know they can find an updraft where you can't even think of finding one. And you can stay up for hours. Just stay up high enough that you can get back to where you came from. That's great flying. Loved it. I went back to college and graduated, and then I went with B.F. Goodrich for a while. And I was going to be I was in industrial product sales, which meant I would be in the big city all my career. And my wife was from a very small town, and she just didn't like it. So I bought into her family business then, milling business, feed processing. And then I went into public lecturing, safety education lecturing, which was the best job I ever had. I really enjoyed it. I had audiences, high school assemblies, you know, teach driving and just safety, and put on demonstrations with automobiles, skid tests, and so on. And I had a lot of letters of people who said I saved their lives because they heeded what I said about seatbelts and that. But I couldn't make any money at it. And so I resigned that, and then I went into engineering automatic feed processing systems for large livestock producers, where you push a button and feed the cattle and push another button and feed hogs or chickens or whatever, the equipment, which was very interesting and remunerative for a long time. And then I went into, retired, went down to Florida because the other business was shot. And I lucked out again. I became public works director for City of Madeira Beach, which I'd never done before, but I knew, having come from the farm, I knew all about diesels and all the equipment and all the other stuff, so they hired me, and I think I was very successful. I should have done it a long, long time ago. I had a crew of, I think, 37 or 38, and I reduced costs tremendously, and I think I was 5 fewer people I needed when we got through, simply by consolidating places and getting the equipment that they needed. Well, I think that the radical Muslims are out to kill everybody in the world who's not a Muslim. I really think that. Really radical. And they claim their Bible tells them that. But you look at their Bible and compare it to which I've done, compare it to our Bible, and it's almost verbatim. It just, instead of Jesus, it's Muhammad the prophet. And the Acts, all the Bible names are the same. It's really interesting to go to a mosque and they'll give you a book and read it, compare it to our Bible, and it's amazing. The books are a little shorter, but it's an amazing thing. But I really kind of worry about it because these guys, anytime that you got somebody willing to commit suicide, it's rough. Boy, when the kamikazes came, it was just rough. As long as they're determined to get that plane in there, you can shoot the hell out of it, and if he can control it, it'll get there. The suicide is really difficult to stop. It's a strange kind of war. No boundaries, no uniforms, no way to tell. We've had spies in regular wars that you didn't know, but they weren't handling the explosives and everything else. They were just observing and spying. And these people have no boundaries, no country, no nothing. I think it's going to be rough. I hope and pray not, but I'm certainly grateful to Bush for going after him, because I've had several people who are familiar out there and in the Arab areas, and they never expected us to come after them. They thought they could get by with anything because they had been. And I think it put a whole new light on there. I think that's why they're trying so hard to beat us and beat Bush now, is they're scared, that we're going to come after him. And I think it's the only way to handle it, unless the Arab people themselves start to turn on them. And I think they're scared to do it right now. I think they're with us on it, but they're scared. I think that's the trouble in Iraq right now. They're scared we'll leave, and if they start cooperating with us, they'll be dead. So I think we're in for it. I think we'll get it here too before it's over. I don't know what they're waiting for, but I'm sure that we'll get it again.